this idea of the proto-smiley. Maybe if you can elaborate a bit
Yeah.
on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously it's become just like such a part of our, vernacular experience, like just moving through the world, and it's just become like very, just such a central part of the way that we communicate, which is like quite reductive, but also there's like a literacy to it that's become really interesting. But I mean, I wasn't necessarily interested in the emoji particularly. However, of course, it's an association that comes to mind when you see the pieces, but I kind of a little bit liked the bait and switch of it. Like, so obviously, when circulating images of the works, for example, they sort of get reframed within that space of, social media and kind of that kind of exchange. But as artworks, they function very differently. So the first thing being that the images themselves precede the invention of the emoji. So there's kind of this interesting kind of like historical little link there that I'm not the first one to kind of acknowledge that, but it's like, it becomes part of the logic of the piece that they precede, what we now know as the emoji. But yeah, so that pain scale, so the initial, it's called the universal pain scale, or sometimes it's called like universal pain assessment tool. They have different names. It's kind of a reason for being was to kind of come up with a way to measure, like coming up with a metric for something that is quite universal, but also abstract and very individuated. And so I was kind of thinking about how that fit perfectly in terms of a schema that would kind of present this intersection between something that's like deeply personal and interior. I mean, kind of unreachable on some level, but then something that's really sort of like democratic and generic and kind of like intended to be for everyone. And that's something that is consistent in the work for many, many years, is like trying to maybe locate the pulse of where those kinds of intersections happen in the world, whether it's, this is maybe the first time that I've used like a graphic particularly. Other things have been other forms or other media that I've kind of mined or explored in an anatomical way. And so this is the first time I was really using like a graphic per se, which is also why it felt really relevant to the Biennial too. I was like, well, I just happen to be doing this series right now that's like really specifically mining graphic information. But yeah, so like thinking about that and then realizing, oh, at the same time, this kind of like very, sort of serious project of it's like a medical tool also has this kind of like very thin sort of like generic kind of like possibility within it. And then for that to have some relation to maybe the way that we just are like communicating daily seemed interesting, because it would bring along with it both this like gaze upon this thing that is very familiar if you've been in a sort of a hospital ever. They're everywhere, or at least in American hospitals are everywhere. But then the familiarity and the kind of like possible misunderstanding of them as emojis, I thought actually was a space that could be an interesting kind of aspect of the work too. And then also to sort of think about them as, as like these like forebears of this thing we use all the time. So that was like another way in which that like universality kind of like would function. So it's a relation. It's not the kind of the locus of the work, or it's not for me like the sort of like theoretical space of the work, but I think that it's inevitably an association that comes to mind.